Let's bow our heads. Father, thank you for our church, our pastor, and our congregates. Special prayers for and blessings on Rick and Ginger as they joined the church this morning. We ask prayers, the pastor's kids, praises for a new baby born in a family here. And we ask that you guide and bless direct our discussions today. In thy name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Well, we're going to talk about social principles, and everybody here has a copy, and anyone at home who desires a copy, I can send an electronic copy to you. We'll kind of go through this over the next several weeks. Some of you may not even know what social principles are, so this morning is kind of an introduction to that, a little bit of history, a little bit of content. I can tell you that it is not a Bible focused. In other words, we're not going to be doing a lot of scripture reading. And it does call for a response from folks that are here. And it's okay if there are criticisms, and it's okay if there's agreement. It's okay if one person says, I don't agree with the rest of you. That would be in stark contrast to normally what we see in society today. You know, everything's polarized and you can't agree to disagree. I'm not sure if that will occur, but let's go on. The social principles are a faith response to what the United Methodist Church's position is on societal issues. It's an expression of common ground that we can share for vulnerable people on our planet. As a member of the United Methodist Church, folks here and elsewhere, it really should be part of our responsibilities as a church member to understand where the church stands. Now, we're going to find out that you don't have to agree with the social principles. It's not like the sacrament of baptism. There are certain things, there are certain rules that are required of people joining the church. This is not a church rule. This is a church guidance. And so you can agree that nothing in here is what you agree with, or you could say everything is all right, and people can have an opinion that's different than yours. This is a historical Methodist thing. Okay, John Wesley invested relationships with people most affected by social inequities, making ministry to the poor, the incarcerated, to the vulnerable a priority in his Methodism, in his groups of folks when they went out onto the streets. He and his early band of Methodists promoted equity in health care, sustainable economic development and food production and distribution, access to clean environment, equitable access to education. He spoke out against imperialism and colonialism, mass incarceration, human trafficking. He promoted religious tolerance and the dignity of indigenous people. And so you'll find elements of that throughout the social principles as we go through them. These ideas about social consciousness were at the heart of Methodism when it first started. And as Methodists, I don't believe that we can engage in our mission, which is to make disciples of Jesus for the transformational world, without understanding and without having an understanding of where the church stands and where we stand on some of these principles. So as we read and hopefully you study these principles, you may find yourself nodding in agreement, or you may vehemently disagree. You may discover that there's a topic in here that you have not thought about, or that you even genuinely feel like you should have an opinion on. There are others who will stand up against what you feel some of these principles tell us. So let's talk a little bit about where they come from. The actual social principles are part of the United Methodist Book of Discipline. How many in here know when I say the Book of Discipline what that is? Okay. The Book of Discipline are the policies and the beliefs and the polity of the United Methodist Church. In other words, if you're a Methodist, how you act and behave and how the church responds and how the church is organized is all in the Book of Discipline. So it's like the U.S. Constitution in a way. It's probably broader than the Constitution is too broad to compare it actually to the Book of Discipline, but the social principles that we're talking about are part of the Book of Discipline. I was going to grab a copy out of the library and I neglected to do that. But what the discipline helps us do is helps us connect more than 43,000 local churches and about 12 million Methodists across the world, literally. The General Conference, which is the United Methodist Church highest policy-making body, has the authority to change the social principles, and we'll talk some more about that in a minute. So I think I need to talk a little bit about polity, P-O-L-I-T-Y. Anybody know what that word means? I didn't know what it meant until I attended a class on it. It really talks about the bureaucratic structure of the United Methodist Church. So I'm going to digress a little bit just to give you that so you understand when I say General Conference and their authorities for making changes in this. In a general context, the United Methodist Church, from a governance point of view, is the U.S. and the world are divided up into large geographical areas. So in the United States, we have jurisdictions. You notice that we're in the southeastern jurisdiction. I'm going to turn this a little bit here those are the jurisdictions for the United States. And then across the world, there are geographical areas called general conferences. So you can see the 7 general conferences there: Africa, Central and Southern Europe, Congo, Germany. I'm sure there's a history as to why they're divided up that way, but each of the jurisdictions in the United States and these central conferences across the world encompass the leadership and the geographical regions for the United Methodist Church. So if you were to go to a United Methodist Church in the Congo, then you would be part of that church, and the pastor and the bishop would all be part of that central conference. There are 3 major components to the church, okay? So these are like the agencies and the Congress and Senate of the United States. These are how the church body gets work done. There's the council of bishops. These are bishops who are selected in each of these jurisdictional and central conferences. They belong to those, they are elected by those jurisdictions, so they have representation. The bishops are clergy, elected for a period of 4 years, and they're assigned a geographical area within the U.S. jurisdictions or the central conferences. So if you're a bishop selected in Germany, then you're given an area within Germany for which you are responsible as a leader. There is the Judicial Council. This is like the church's Supreme Court. It has both clergy and laypersons, 9 people, I believe. They are the court of the church. They are elected by the General Conference, there's that word again, we'll talk about that in a minute, for 8-year terms. They determine the constitutionality of acts or proposed acts of the general, jurisdictional, central, or annual conferences. So let's say you're a member of our conference, which is the Virginia Conference, and you want to bring a petition to the General Conference on reorganizing. Instead of having 5 jurisdictions in the United States, we're only going to have 1. Okay? Well, and if that were approved, then that would go to the Judicial Council to see whether or not it was legal in accordance with the church discipline. The last couple of years, there have been petitions made to change the wording on our beliefs as a Methodist church relative to homosexuality. If those changes were to be approved, they would have to go to the Judicial Council to see whether or not they were lawful and legal in accordance with our church discipline. If we made a change to the church discipline, which in fact the latter would be required in order to make a difference, then that court would decide whether or not it was legal in accordance with our discipline. Then there's a General Conference. Okay, this is the decision-making body within the United Methodist Church. It determines official policy. It speaks for the church. It has elective representatives, half clergy and half laypersons. From around the world, every one of these jurisdictions and central conferences send delegates to the General Conference, and they all have a vote. The body of the General Conference is half clergy and half laypersons. So it's not just clergy that are making decisions for our church. And it's a democratic process. They call to order, they submit petitions, they're voted on, they're discussed, people can stand up and speak for or against any of those petitions, but that's how things get done. It is that General Conference that approves the social principles that you have in front of you, and they become part of the church discipline, which means they're part of what we believe. And again, they're not church law. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, we have things called conferences, and conferences can be both geographical and a body of work. So we are part of, in our southeastern jurisdiction, we are part of the Virginia Conference. So when I say Virginia Conference or annual conference, that means you're part of the Virginia Conference. It also means that once a year, all the members of the Virginia Conference get together and they conduct business of the church. They promote programs, they approve petitions, they go to the General Conference, they approve people to be responsible. Again, it is represented by both clergy and laypersons. So the last annual conference, which was in June, I was the layperson and Pastor Witt was the pastor who represented our church. Dale and Jackie, what
district, through the coastal district.
Okay, so they're part of the district, and that would be within our annual conference, within our Virginia conference. It's divided up into districts, and so we are the coastal Virginia district. It used to be 2. The Eastern Shore had a district, and the parts of Norfolk and Virginia Beach had a district, but that's been changed. So the person in charge of a district is the district superintendent. Her name is Reverend Cecilia Brooks, and our bishop is Bishop Sue Halpert Johnson. She comes from, I think her original conference is down in Georgia, right? She's part of the Georgia conference, which doesn't show up on here, but was part of the previous discussion that we had. So what you have...
Is that once Elizabeth River? Is that what you're saying? It changed to coastal, or is that different?
Yes, they combined, it used to be Elizabeth River and the Eastern Shore. They combined them, and now they're called the Virginia Coastal District.
Okay.
So it's a big challenge. They used to have 2 district superintendents. Now there's just one for, I won't say double the churches, but a larger number of churches. So the way it would go is we have our local church here, all right? Once a year, we have a charge conference. That's where we approve things like the church budget, the list of officers to support the church for the next year. That report goes to the district superintendent. Our charge conference is normally chaired by the district superintendent. Any information that we might have that would go to the annual conference. The annual conference is chaired by our bishop. The general conference is chaired by a bishop and attended by all the bishops, but they do not have a vote. So the only people that are voting are the clergy and the laypersons who are represented to the general conference. So that's kind of the background for how the Methodist Church is organized. And it's important for you to know that, because when we look at these social principles, you're going to ask yourselves, well, who decided that that would be in there? Well, it was decided by clergy and laypersons. And so there's an awful lot of discussion. They actually have several committees that get together and they review, but ultimately the general conference has to approve the social principles. So let's talk about the history of these social principles. Where did they come from? Well, the predecessor to what you have in front of you was first written in 1908 and took the form as a social creed. This was the first document of its kind written by a church, as far as we know. And in this case, the church was a Methodist Episcopal church. Anybody know what was going on in our country or the United Kingdom in 1908? What was the social environment like? And why would a church decide all of a sudden in 1908 to write something called the Social Creed? Well, if you do a little bit of research on it, you'll find that there was lots of poverty. There were a lot of job deaths. There were 2 million children working in factories and mines. It was just a bad time. The Industrial Revolution was in full force. There was rapid rural displacement and relocation, mass national migration, unchecked corporate greed, and industrial urbanization. Working conditions were brutally deplorable. Not unlike a little earlier time. Everybody remembers the movie Oliver Twist, right? Can you remember the kids in the streets and the begging and the deplorable conditions, sewage in the streets? Just awful. That was a little earlier. That was more the time of John Wesley, who was he was living in the 1700s. Okay, so this is 1908, but this is a similar situation caused by the industrialization of and the growing of urban areas. That people, back then were mostly rural-based farmers and things like that, and all of a sudden people were being displaced. So it just was a bad time. And so this church, the Methodist Episcopal Church, wrote this social creed. The 2 predecessors denominations for our church, the Evangelical United Brethren and the Methodist Church, when they formed together in, I think it was 1968, they each had a social creed. I was a member, my dad was a member of the United Methodist Church, and I can remember when the two churches combined. There were a lot of things that had to be discussed, and you can imagine the General Conference of the Methodist Church and the organization of the UB had to decide how they were going to pull their beliefs together, okay, and they did, and I think it was a good thing. Both of these two denominations, their social creed was based on the 1908 social creed. Initially, the two statements were printed separately in that discipline in 1968. And then in 1972, the two statements were consolidated into what we call the social principles. They continued to evolve, these principles continued to evolve. So every General Conference, which meets every 4 years and collects all of those representatives from all those central conferences and the jurisdictions within the United States, review the social principles, and you can imagine they bring them up to date. There was a time when pastors couldn't be divorced. There was a time when women could not be pastors. Now, those were part of the law of the church, but the social principles addressed some of the social issues that caused those changes to happen in the church hierarchy. And you'll see that in as we go through some of these. For example, in 2016, the General Conference made changes addressing such topics as bullying, family violence and abuse, pornography, cultural identity, rights of immigrants, rights of racial and ethnic persons, divorce, abortion. The 2012, the previous one when the General Conference met, brought into developments that came from Africa and Europe and the Philippines. So this is a living document, updated at least every 4 years to reflect the changes in society. So you can imagine, if you think back, if you go all the way back to 1908, and just think about the changes in our society and how the church has had to respond to those issues, and they're reflected in the social principles. Now, you might be asking, and I've already mentioned, as a United Methodist, do I have to agree with everything that's in these social principles? And the answer is no. They are not church law. They are a call to faithfulness and are intended to be instructional and persuasive, and a call for some prayerful dialogue. So that's what we're going to have in this class, hopefully. Some dialogue. Currently, the social principles, if you go to the front page where there's an index, this is the 2020 social principles. It's organized across 4 sections. 2016 had 5 sections. The first one is a community of all creation, and when we get to that, we'll talk about things like the stewardship of our earth, including the sustainment of economic ecosystems, climate change, food production, treatment of animals, outer space, science. Quite a list, huh? The next section, which is called the economic community, talks about globalization, human sexuality, human trafficking, farming and agriculture, corporate responsibility, the Sabbath, graft and corruption, and dignity of work. Any of you raised on farms here? Okay, I spent a lot of time on a farm as a kid. The next section, the social community, talks about families, individuals, human sexuality, marriage, divorce, substance abuse, organ donation, sexual harassment, the media, gender equality. Do these things kind of strike a note with you? If you watch any of the news, you read a newspaper or read periodicals, these things are in the news quite frequently, some more than others. And the last area is called the political community. Talks about the death penalty, war and military service, health care, indigenous communities, immigration, and sexual identity. And those are hit you in the face just about every day if you're watching the news, right? So I have a couple exercises. I have 3 cards here. One says yes, one says no, and one's got a question mark. So I'm going to ask you, I'm going to read some of these. If you take one of each of those 3, I'm going to go through some of these just as kind of a precursor of what we're going to be getting into. And if you wouldn't mind, I would like you each to, when I read a statement, you say, yes, I agree with that, or no, I don't agree with that, or question mark, I have no opinion about it.
No clue.
No clue. Yeah, and you know, for years, I myself never worried about some of these things, like abortion. It was always kind of in the background, and I never had an opinion about it. Nobody ever challenged me on it, and then, you know, it kept becoming more and more part of our social structure and discussions that were taking place within our communities. And so, you know, I guess I have some opinions now. Same thing with homosexuality. Never thought a whole lot about it until I became aware of people who were of that persuasion, and it then became part of how do I deal with this? What do I do with it? So once everybody has a card, I'm just going to, and what I want you to do is look around and see whether or not you're a part of the group, not that that's good or bad, or whether you're the only person who said yes. I hope you have the courage to just say that, because that's part of what we need to talk about in here, right? I suspect that most of us in here, just because I know most of you, will probably be uniformly probably have the same opinions, but I could be surprised. Like I said, I myself, some of these things I just never worried about. Okay, and then after we're done, I'm gonna ask you about your general impressions. So look around the room. You know, it's not. I'm not trying to put anybody on a pedestal or somebody to throw fruit at. This is just kind of for our own edification, mostly to get you an idea of what's in here. Okay, so let's start. And when I say we, what that means is we as the General Conference, we as the General United Methodist Church body. Okay, here's the first one. Global warming and climate change are already creating extreme conditions that threaten the entirety of life on Earth. Okay, pretty uniform there. The burning of fossil fuels, including coal, oil, and to a lesser extent natural gas, is the greatest single contributor to the buildup of greenhouse gases and subsequent warming of the Earth's atmosphere. Okay. We confess that negative impacts resulting from the degradation of the natural world have fallen disproportionately on marginalized communities. You understand what that means?
Yeah.
Let me
Can
give
you
you.
put that in English?
Let me give you an example. If you go to the United Nations today, all the third world countries are saying, hey, we're suffering from drought and hurricanes that you industrialized companies created. So we should be compensated in some way. Let me read again. We confess that the negative impacts resulting from the degradation of the natural world has fallen disproportionately on marginalized communities. So we, the industrial nations, are doing things that are causing the marginalized nations to suffer.
Is it?
I don't know.
Okay? All right.
Like a
So-
dummy.
So maybe in this discussion, we'll learn more, right? We'll learn more about what that means. Here's another one. Animals employed in agriculture and other forms of labor are to be free from cruel or abusive types of treatments and provided ample rest and nourishment. Okay? We reject the exploitation, commodification, and militarization of space.
We reject it?
We reject the exploitation and making a commodity and using the military in space. Okay? We affirm the value of science and reason in providing deeper understandings of the origin and functioning of the universe. Okay? We reject religious teachings that view the accumulation of wealth as a sign of God's favor and poverty as a sign of God's disfavor. Okay? We support peaceful and nonviolent efforts, including boycotts, letter writing campaigns, appeals to stockholders, and divestiture as effective means of expressing collective dissatisfaction with companies that engage in unjust or harmful practices.
You don't have to get forced.
We deplore the growing monopolization of the measure of agriculture production by corporations and large agribusinesses.
Did you say we reject?
Yes, we deplore
Oh.
the growing monopolization of the means of agricultural production by corporations and large agribusinesses.
I'm not sure what that is.
I know several large agribusinesses. I don't think so.
Okay, what it really means is, and we'll talk about this when we get there in some of the statistics, that much of the arable land in the United States and around the world is owned not by, it's not farmed by individual farmers anymore. It's farmed by large businesses. And they obviously drive policies that affect people, among others, farmers, individual farmers. So you have a lot of individual farmers that are leaving their profession because they can't handle the taxes, they can't handle the policies that come out of the
They're
government.
selling their land for big money to these big corporations.
Yes.
Big money.
And there are also advantages to that too. These large agribusinesses become very efficient. We're talking about genetic modifications to crops, talking about the use of pesticides to keep weeds down. So there are a lot of pluses and minuses, huh?
Agricultural department.
Yeah. We support workers' freedom of association, including their rights to organize unions, to engage in collective bargaining, and to protest both unsafe working conditions and unjust employment policies. And that's pretty much in the news today, right?
Yeah.
Writer's strike, Pastor mentioned it this morning.
They're getting ready to resolve.
Yeah, it sounds like the writer's strike may be coming to an end. The UAW, though, is enlarged their layoffs to other factories now. We urge individuals, families, congregations, and other church bodies to educate themselves about the use of their investment funds and to leverage their economic clout by mandating the redirection of their funds from industries that negatively impact people or the environment. You understand what that says?
That's long.
When you invest your retirement, are you investing in companies that abuse the environment, or is that not on your radar? The president just passed an ongoing. What he wants to say is that I can't remember exactly, but basically it says that when companies, as part of the federal government, I believe, they must consider investing in companies that are not abusing the environment, for example.
Okay.
So there's or that they've done a, what's a review called when they want to build something? Environmental impact statement. Are they doing that appropriately before you spend money on that? Should be one of the considerations in how you invest money.
Okay, I get it now. Can you, do we already answer that? Okay. Dang, I was ready to answer that now.
Well, the questions are good, right? If you don't know, then when we get to that area, we'll talk a little bit about that. And I'm going to encourage you during the week when you know you're coming to Sunday school and you know what the next lesson is, keep an eye out on the newspapers and periodicals, things you read. Cut it out, bring it to class, and we'll talk about it. We encourage open adoption so that children may know all information relevant to them, both medically and relationally. Everybody understand what open adoption is, right? Okay. We support the rights of all people to exercise personal consent in sexual relations, to make decisions about their own bodies, and be supported in these decisions to receive comprehensive sexual education. Okay? We affirm marriage as a sacred, lifelong covenant that brings two people of faith into union with one another. What doesn't that say?
It doesn't say we don't like a divorce. Basically.
What else does it say?
Doesn't say that you have to be a man and a woman.
Correct. Now, I'm taking some of these out of context. So I'm taking them so that they cause you to think, okay? So when we get to that, you may say, well, that's not what you said when we first started. I'm intentionally making some of these things to make you listen and look. We also affirm the importance of civil marriage, the legal recognition of domestic unions by the state.
Oh. In other words, if you weren't married in the church, it's still
Okay.
recognized that.
Yeah, civil marriages are okay.
I'm glad you know about this marriage.
We reject marital relations with children and youth under the age of 18. Anybody in here know somebody who was married
Before.
under 18?
Yeah.
So what the church
My
says,
mother-in-law was
Oh,
16.
wow.
okay,
I
Wow.
think my father-in-law was 19.
yeah.
Wow.
I think it was a shock.
We do not support efforts to withhold a church's ministry from divorced people or to deny them opportunities for leadership in the church, whether clergy or lay. We urge to refrain from the use of any illicit or licit intoxicants, drugs, or other substances that foster addiction, impair mental faculties, and physical abilities.
Illicit was the word.
Well, it says any illicit, which is legal, or any illicit intoxicants, drugs or other substances that foster addiction, impair mental facilities, or physical abilities. Now, what's the status of marijuana in the state of Virginia?
Okay.
It's legal.
Federal government still says it's illegal, right? The state says it's legal.
Yeah,
So
it's legal.
what this says is, if you believe that marijuana leads to harder drugs, then you would say, I would agree with this, because it impairs. If you smoke marijuana and you drive a car, it's probably no different than if you drink and drive a car, right? So that's what this is asking you to consider. We urge those who choose to consume alcoholic beverages, including wine and beer, to do so wisely and in moderation. Okay, so it doesn't say you should be alcohol free, right? I'm trying to read this so it's a question. Direct or indirect ingestion or inhalation of nicotine or other chemicals found in commercial tobacco products, the church recommends complete abstinences. So the church says don't smoke and don't be in an environment where there's tobacco smoke. That's the church's stand on smoking.
I guess we kicked Bill out,
Yeah, Bill and Randy both.
okay? Oh, yeah, Randy, I forgot.
And you better not walk in the wave of the smoke that they're out front, right?
That's right.
So the church says,
Don't do it.
don't smoke and don't create an environment where,
Cause harm to others.
how about we affirm the right of people in the process of dying to participate actively in the decision-making process. That doesn't say anything about euthanasia, right? There is a statement about that. We'll talk about that later. Oh, here it is. As a church, we oppose both euthanasia and suicide.
That's
I
hard.
assume, well, that's what the social principles say, okay? We believe that suicide does not bar people from God's grace. One of the, I get emotional when I think about it. I was teaching Sunday school in Tennessee, and I had a woman in my class whose mother had committed suicide. And I can't remember what we were talking about in class, but she came up to me after class crying, wanted to know whether I thought her mom was in heaven.
Wow.
Try to answer that question.
Yeah, really.
The best I could do was say, I don't know, but God will look favorably, not because she's committed suicide. Suicide is not something, at least that's what the social principles say, right? Suicide is not something that would prevent somebody from going to heaven. We reject the practice of gambling. True or false? Yes or no? Don't know.
You wanna go to Portsmouth this afternoon? I'm ready.
That before this past couple of years was probably not a question most of us probably didn't think about. But the fact that the casino is there in Portsmouth, we go back.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah, lottery, I didn't think about that, that's gambling.
we go back to my wife's hometown, and there are 2 casinos
Oh, really?
in Connecticut.
Wow.
And I will admit that we go there for recreation. But everybody understands the problem that gambling addiction can cause in families and individuals. We reject any beliefs, policies, or practices that envision women and men as unequal in either religious or secular settings. Don, I noticed you almost went for that. No. Let's see. We are concerned about media monopolies and the tendency of media control to rest in the hands of a few large corporations. Talk about something that's very politically in our lexicon nowadays, okay? We encourage individuals to take care of when expressing their views on social media, recognizing the need for compassion and the harm that can be done to others when such compassion is lacking. I think that's the biggest problem. We have a lot of folks who don't understand compassion, and so much can be read into, and my wife says it all the time, you know, you can't look at somebody and see their body language or listen to their voice inflection when you get a text message. So half the time when you think something is wrong about the text message, you just don't know. That's the problem. We insist that medical experimentation, including genetic engineering, be performed within established bioethical parameters. We're going to talk about cloning when we get there. We strongly support organ donation. Okay. We support the provision of comprehensive and age-appropriate education for sexual health, as well as access to consistent, effective, and affordable contraception. Okay. We recognize, listen to this carefully, we recognize that these and other tragic conflicts of life, and I haven't identified those, with life may justify decisions to terminate the life of a fetus. In these limited circumstances, we support the legal option of abortion and insist that such procedures be performed by trained medical providers in clean and safe settings. Okay. I'll just do a few of these, and then I have another set of questions. Healthcare is a human right. Healthcare is a human right.
That's it.
Okay. All women have a right to equal educational opportunities, protection of their bodies, reproductive justice, parental rights and responsibilities, employment, and equitable compensation and promotion. We are committed to supporting the equal rights, liberties, and protections of all people regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. Okay. Individual religious beliefs must not be used to deny basic human rights. See a lot of attention being paid to certain things like bakery shops refusing to make wedding cakes for gay people, right? Where does that sit? Now, I have another set of, and we'll just do this briefly, but raise your hand, show your cards. I'll read the statement about you, and so this will give us a little bit of idea of where we come from as a group here. You are the oldest child in your family. You are raised in a farming or rural community. Okay? Your first language was a language other than English. Okay? You work to pay for some or all of your education. Okay? You have ever served in the military.
As a dependent.
Yeah?
You served, girl.
You have visited a mosque, synagogue, or house of worship other than a church. Okay? You know someone who abuses or has abused alcohol or other drugs. You know anyone who has died of a tobacco-related disease. Do you know anybody who has died of a tobacco-related disease? Yeah. You know or have known someone living with HIV or AIDS. Okay. You know or have known someone who has received an organ transplant. Okay. You know someone who has had an abortion. Okay. You know someone who identifies as gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender. You have ever been bullied or have ever bullied someone else. Okay. You have known someone who has survived domestic or gender violence. You know someone who has contemplated or completed suicide. You have ever received preferential treatment because of your race. You know anyone who has been incarcerated. You have ever been part of a picket line or a protest demonstration. Okay. So as you looked around at some of these answers, any conclusions anybody has come up with?
They're all different.
I think
We have different
general,
experiences.
if you put them all together and add them all up, they're all pretty much.
Yeah, we're all pretty much. Were there any areas where we saw maybe just one individual or very few individuals? How about the number of areas where people had question marks? I thought there was a reasonably large number of question marks. So, like I said, it may be an area that you're not concerned about. You know, it didn't affect your life, so, you know, it's just beyond you. I guess my opinion is you can't respond to each and every social issue that comes up, right? Generally, we respond or have opinions about social issues when they affect us or we know somebody who it has affected. And when you talk about large social issues like folks living in poverty or the number of veterans who are homeless, for example, that kind of hits all of us in the face, and we probably either have reacted. My guess is, if you're like me, we've probably not reacted at all. We deplore the situation, but we don't actively take some kind of stand or actively do something about it. And I think that's one of the objectives of my doing this is to give us some ideas about things that we feel passionate about in terms of what we think are bad things in our society and may encourage some of us to take more direct action rather than having an opinion. You know, there is a big difference between having an opinion about environmental changes and whether or not we recycle, for example, and treat that seriously. So I think it's going to be interesting. I hope you'll come prepared. We are going to talk next Sunday about community of all creation. So read that, please, this week, and come back next Sunday and read it earlier in the week so that during the week, if you come across something on the TV or something in the newspaper or something on social media that reflects some opinion, good or bad, within those, please bring it, and we'll talk about it. When we leave, if you just drop your cards off up here, I don't know if I'll use them again, but I thought it was an interesting way to make that happen. So let's bow our heads. Our Lord God, as we go about our business and in our world as Christians, we should be mindful of the things that society presents us with. Do we take those things as a Christian and apply Christian principles to them? Do we think, what would Jesus do in that situation? Do we actively take a stand? Do we stand up against people who speak derogatorily on an opposite position? Do we come away with anger in our hearts? How do we handle these things, and how do we approach some of these very contentious issues? We hope and pray, Lord, that you will guide us over the next several weeks in coming up with some ways to deal with that. Please be with each and every one of us as we go out our business this week and bring us back safely next Sunday. In thy name we pray. Amen.